What's interesting is that Rich listed a number of projects that are all important, but the question is, at some point, somebody has to decide which is number one, which is number two. Somebody has to make that decision, and the decision makers come from different places. So if you're a member of Congress, you have certain priorities. If you're a state legislature, you may have different priorities, and you may be hearing from different constituencies of people. It would be great if there was one answer, if everybody could come together, kumbaya, hold your hands, and come up with that master list. But there is no one list because everybody has a different perspective, and that's the problem, is that a lot of these projects are competing for the same pots of dollars. And it's very hard for one entity to make those decisions. And that's why if you're going to advocate for a particular project, go for that, but understand you're competing. And I'm thinking of the Corridor Cities Transitway, which is competing against the Purple Line and the Baltimore Red Line, as we talked about before. And sometimes you may have to make it your number one because somebody else is not going to make it their number one. And you're going to have to find out ways to make that happen. That's where you have to get creative.
Are they competing because they're redundant, or are they competing because there's not enough money?
No, it's just dollars.
Resources.
Okay, I just wasn't sure. I didn't understand.
But there actually is, or there are at least two lists that I'm aware of. One is a region-wide list that is run by the Transportation Planning Board, and we do that each year for the region. Some of us have worked over the last 7 or 8 years to try and give some more teeth to that list, but we've been trying to put parameters around it to say, how do we as a region begin to grow differently? And they're trying to do that, and they're trying to implement that. And fortunately, the federal government has begun to start to work with us a little bit on that, so that it's not just a matter of looking at a project that is most cost effective and looking at just the cheapest, but it's also looking at something what Rob said, which is, what is the economic value? Where do we start to see the biggest bang for the buck, and not just making sure it's the cheapest project out there. And so the region has been doing that, and we're starting to do some more. There actually have been efforts underway to look at some region-wide bus networks. We've started some things just this past year to see are there some places that we can begin to see collaboration between Virginia and Maryland. But the other thing we've got to do is, actually the biggest thing we've seen over the course of the last 3 years has been a recognition on the part of the entire region that Metro needs a lot of additional assistance. And so all of the region has to participate on that. There's a region-wide compact that makes decisions. And all of the jurisdictions in the region actually recognize the need, stepped up to the plate, have put resources in to provide a dedicated funding source for Metro. Interestingly, the last group in has been the federal government, but we finally kind of got them to come along too. But I think that shows a commitment to looking more regionally than we have in the past. But it is a challenge, but the lists exist. The challenge now is to really give some teeth to that and start to really follow through on that list and get everybody on the same page. But people are working at it, and I think even more than so 8 years ago, people in the region understand that a decision in Northern Virginia has an impact in Maryland and vice versa. People are starting to really get that because you begin to see. I mean, one big problem we're going to run into is you've got hot lanes coming north from Virginia that end at the American Legion Bridge. What happens when you hit the bridge? And we're having a conversation here that brings hot lanes potentially down from northern Montgomery County and ends about here. And so we've got kind of this donut hole. And so, I mean, there are some examples where we're not connected, but we've got to start to really get the political will on both sides to try and get some of those things done. But, I mean, there is a list, there is some prioritization. We're not where we ought to be, but we are making some progress.
Beverly?
That's, I think, the beginning of a very good, the technical answer as well. And there is a technical answer. Actually, in Maryland law, there has been a process set forth. It was established probably now about 40 years ago, and I think it's probably something that the Blue Ribbon Commission will be revisiting because I think it was based upon where Maryland was 30, 40 years ago, and that was a county prioritization process where counties are required, in fact, by law every year to tell the Department of Transportation what their priorities are, and there needs to be a consensus when they do that among the elected officials, both the state elected officials as well as the county representatives. And I think that has worked very well in many ways for a very long time. I think, though, as we've seen, as we've now grown and matured as a region, that then there's the overlay of the MPO process, which Councilmember Knapp was referring to. But then we've also seen, even beyond that, I think a need for much more regional connections, into Western Maryland, into Southern Maryland from the Prince George's County side. And last year there was some legislation asking us to look more closely when we do our prioritization process, to look at smart growth and land use and other kinds of things when we're looking at that prioritization process. And I would be amazed if the Blue Ribbon Commission doesn't begin to look at some of these issues with regard to, okay, that's how we prioritized in the past. I think it worked very well for a long time, but is it ready for that process to mature to a different place? And I don't know, I'll ask the senator to comment.
I wouldn't disagree. I think we just had one meeting earlier in the week, and the commission is going to be making recommendations by the end of the year, ideally, for the next General Assembly session. And then it's going to be meeting again all next year. It was just recently appointed by the governor just last month. So it's we did a 30,000-foot overview, which I think everyone needs a kind of baseline of where are things today. And then we're going to also be looking at what's going on in other parts of the country. What's working, what's not working. As far as the prioritization, I think you've kind of heard it from everybody. I mean, I would just chime in that I think, obviously we need to be looking at it from a regional perspective. And then reiterating the point I made kind of in my opening statement is, as we're looking at metrics of how do you prioritize, for me, one additional metric in there that is given, I guess, some credence right now, but I think should get more emphasis, is kind of the bang for the buck that I mentioned, the economic development aspect. How does a certain transportation project, whether it be a road, whether it be intersection improvements, whether it be bus, whether it be rail, whatever it is, I think we need to kind of look at that as a mechanism to encourage our business community to thrive, which is going to impact our quality of life overall because of the additional tax revenue that you get from that. So I think that is going to be part of the discussion as well. It's going to be both the short term and a long term. Obviously, we need to address some things more immediately. I think we're going to do that. But then we also need to look at the long term. And I think it gets to some of the points the Secretary mentioned as far as, what criteria should we be looking at as far as prioritization? What's the proper mix of revenue inputs coming into the transportation trust fund? I think it's about 30% right now gas tax. About 10 years ago, it was like 36%. We now have a small portion from a couple years ago, that comes from the sales tax. Should we continue in that direction, or should we be looking, and as Councilman Knapp mentioned, we have to, it's almost by necessity, looking and exploring and moving forward on the concept of public-private partnerships where we can. That is going to have to be an element of it. Some have suggested maybe we need to look at regional transportation authorities. That may be something worth considering as well. There are a number of things that are occurring in other places in the country that we can learn from. And then there's things, we're always a very innovative area of the country, I think, where we can come up with some new ways of doing things to meet the long term, which I think it needs to be, it's kind of the other side of the coin, and then one side being the short term. We need to do both. Hopefully this next session will address some of the short term so we can meet our more immediate needs, and then begin next year after the session concludes with the commission and other input from others about the long term and really looking at the 20-30 year, because I think that'll really, gives us the advantage regionally, economically, global competitively. Those are the kinds of things we need to be looking at, and transportation is a critical part of that.